Good evening and welcome to Slooh. My name is Helen Avery and I'll be here with you the next, hour or so. And tonight we're looking at the constellation Cancer. So there's a lot going on this evening when we're looking at Cancer. So I just kind of wanted to talk you through what might be helpful for you. So amazingly, we've got both telescopes open tonight. We've got Chile and the Canary Islands, which is fantastic. But what happens is what you can see in Chile of the constellation Cancer, you can't see at the same time in Canary Islands. So I've kind of sort of booked the two telescopes, Canary 2 from 9:10 and Chile from now until 10 to 10, and that was kind of what I could get. I couldn't get a full hour on both, but so we're going to sort of be jumping around, so kind of just bear with me. And I would suggest, if you want to make it easier, we're going to stick with Chile, and then we'll move to Canary 3 kind of halfway through for some of the more distant objects. Like we're going to look at some galaxies tonight, and the Beehive cluster, and the King Cobra cluster. So you can obviously on Canary 2 there are a couple of other things I'll point out to you that I haven't booked for Chile. So just to sort of, I know it sounds confusing, but we're going to stay, if you will, stay on Chile and then Canary 3 with me. And of course, if you're on YouTube, you can just enjoy the audio. And I'm going to put up a screen in a minute, because also as we're going through a lot of things, I don't want to keep skipping back to images for you. So I'm just going to leave them up. So let's do that now. There we go. Okay. But before all this, I just want to point out to you that if you are with us in the space station room and you click on, let me think, Chile ultra wide field. Whoa, that or Chile wide field. Okay, there we go. What we're actually looking at here, even just to get started, is Iota Cancri. Iota Cancri, you might say, but I say Iota Cancri. And actually, Mario recommended that we take a look at this, and we're starting with it. It was the only time I could actually get this up in the next hour. So this is a double star, about 300 light years away from Earth, and of course we can see it's a double star. And the brightest star is a yellow G-type bright giant, and so we're going to sort of hang on that. And the fainter is a white A-type main sequence dwarf. So I didn't want you to miss that as we begin. Okay, but I'm just for now going to leap back to the main page that I was on, which just has some images up. So the one you'll see on YouTube and on the live cast page. So Cancer as a constellation is so faint. It's really, really hard to see with the naked eye. We've got like such clear skies here in the northeast at the minute, and I've been out the last couple of nights. It's mild. It's been so beautiful. I've seen the Orion Nebula that we looked at last week with binoculars. It's so clear. I looked for Cancer. Oh boy, did I look for these stars. You just can't see them. I couldn't see them. So you really need some dark skies. But although it is the faintest zodiac constellation, it is so interesting. So we have got so much to talk about tonight. So as we're jumping around the stars, I thought this page might be helpful, so you can sort of see what stars we might be looking at in relation to the entire constellation. You'll see some images here. We're going to talk about the dung beetle. We're going to talk about some Egyptian mythology. The Beehive cluster we're going to delve into and look at sort of tales of Christ relating to the Beehive cluster. And then also obviously talk about the crab and where did the crab come from. So before, to get going, we are going to start our story with a shipwreck. So in the summer of 1982, Mehmet Kakir, a local sponge diver from Yalikavak, a village near Bodrum in Turkey, discovered evidence of a shipwreck close to the east shore of Uluburun, that's in southwest Turkey. And over 10 years and 22,413 dives, it was pieced together that the ship was made from cedar and oak from Lebanon, had likely set sail from Syria in 14 BC and was travelling to Greece, headed to one of the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, with Mycenaean officials on board guarding its precious royal cargo. And it carried vast amounts of copper and tin ready to become bronze, logs of ebony or blackwood, and ivory in the form of elephant tusks. There were like a dozen hippopotamus teeth and ostrich eggshells and pottery and gold and gems of agate and quartz and arrowheads and daggers and cumin and coriander and figs and olives and so many things on board this ship. But there was one very precious item, and that was a gold scarab beetle believed to have belonged to none other than Queen Nefertiti because it had her name on it. Now, if you are over on the Chile scopes, what we're looking at right now is accubens, and that is Alpha Cancri. I'm just going to make sure I'm looking at that myself with you, and there it is in the Chile whitefield. So Alpha Cancri, accubens means the claws, and I know it's sort of challenging to keep toggling pages, but if you pop back to the main page, you'll see where accubens is in relation to where you would look at as a crab. And this star is 174 light years away, and although it's so faint, you can't see it with the naked eye. It's actually 23 times more luminous than our sun, and I'm told it is has like a really blue hue. So I don't know about your screen, but my screen's going a bit wonky at the moment and looks like a green screen. And it, I believe it's a quadruple star. So just wanted to pause in our shipwreck story while we don't want to miss this Alpha Cancri star accubens. So Queen Nefertiti, whose name is on this gold scarab beetle, ruled in Egypt in the mid-1300s. And she and her pharaoh husband were known for a religious revolution, and one that turned ancient Egypt into a sun-worshipping culture, because Nefertiti and her husband only worshipped Aten, the sun disk. An Egyptian belief had it that a cosmic scarab beetle rolled the sun across the sky. And if you're wondering what any of this has to do with the constellation Cancer, the crab, it's because to the ancient Egyptians, this constellation was instead referred to as Scarabaeus, the scarab beetle. And if you don't know what a scarab beetle is, it is a dung beetle. Yep, exactly. So the constellation we call today Cancer the Crab is in fact, or was in fact, a dung beetle to the ancient Egyptians. But obviously very, very precious because it was on board this ship with all this wonderful cargo, and obviously belonged to this very famous queen who sort of later became sort of almost like a goddess. So, you know, to us, this sort of, as I said, this constellation is almost unnoticeable. And even I was trying to sort of think about the objects within it, and there aren't sort of many. There are some amazing stars that we're looking at tonight. There's, I say there's not many. I mean, there's some galaxies and two clusters, but it's not sort of like the pomp and show that we had with Orion that we've had the past couple of weeks, where it's just so full of things to look at, and you could just spend months and months going through it. But once you sort of understand the importance of the scarab beetle to the ancient Egyptians, you kind of begin to look a bit more closely at this constellation, because you start to think, well, hang on a minute, this is a very faint constellation. Doesn't appear to be particularly interesting, and yet it was called Scarabaeus, and the scarab beetle was extremely important. It was completely sacred to the Egyptians. So what is it about this dung beetle? And once you sort of begin to delve down into what the dung beetle does, you sort of begin to understand why this faint group of stars must have meant something very special to the Egyptians. So we're actually looking at Gamma Cancri right now. This is also known as Asellus borealis, so that's the northern donkey. And we're going to come back to this star a little later because it flanks the Beehive cluster. There's the northern donkey and the southern donkey, and that will become sort of relevant later why they're called the donkey. But just to let you know a couple of things about this star, Asellus borealis, and we're getting a little bit of the colour come through. It's a blue subgiant, and it's about 180 light years away, and more than twice the size of the sun. So, and I was having trouble finding an age on this, and the closest I got was Wikipedia that said 171 million years old, but I just couldn't find data anywhere else, and was kind of surprised because the southern donkey is 2.5 billion years old. So it kind of sort of shocked me that one was so young and one so old. But if you know anything about that, I'd love if you could throw some things up on the discussion board and let me know what you find. But back to this story of our dung beetle. So we know it was so important to the Egyptians, the dung beetle, not just because Queen Nefertiti seems to have this golden scarab with her name on it, but we find it everywhere in ancient Egyptian artifacts. It was used for good luck charms, for seals to stamp documents, for jewelry made of clay. It was found in art. It was connected to Horus, sort of where it sort of became in the middle of having wings. And dung beetles were even mummified. Like I went to recently an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum, and there they had mummified animals. And the scarab beetle was there, tiny mummified scarab beetle. And from what I gather, they were placed in tombs because, well, we'll find out, they were believed to have an association with rebirth. And as I mentioned, they were seen as very sacred. So, you know, if you don't know about dung beetles, what you might think is just this is a beetle that collects feces of animals and sculpts them into a sphere much larger than its body. And then it sort of gets up on its back legs, or it uses back legs to roll it home. And there the female dung beetle lays her eggs in the buried ball. And her young, when they hatch, live off the nutrients of the animal waste, and so do mother and father dung beetle. So when you think about the food chain, these creatures would, to some, be considered as being at the utmost bottom. I mean, the lowest of the low, because they eat and live off poop. That's kind of, you know, how we think on a superficial level about the dung beetle. But here are some things you may not know about this lowly dung beetle. And if you're on Twitter, you would have been quizzed on this in the week. And almost half everyone got this right, so that's not bad. But the dung beetle is an incredible navigator, and it uses the sun in order to find the fastest way home. And using the sun as a reference point rather than landmarks, the beetle can set as direct a course as possible. And that's important because the dung beetle often gets ambushed by other dung beetles looking for poop, if you can believe this. You can have a bit of a fight going on. And the reason we know it uses the sun is because periodically, while rolling the ball of poop, the dung beetle will climb up onto its giant sphere of feces and orient itself with the sun. So this is pretty cool that this dung beetle has this connection to the sun, but it gets even better because it's also found that on a moonlit night, dung beetles, who seem to work around the clock apparently, will use the moon to guide them home safely and swiftly. And, you know, as if this isn't enough, in 2013, a group of scientists asked the question, well, what about when there is no moon? And if you can believe this, they developed these kind of masks so the dung beetles couldn't see the moon. And it turns out that the lowly dung beetle will actually use the Milky Way as its guide instead. It's the only known creature to do so in the entire animal kingdom, which just just blows my mind. So the dung beetle has this amazing scientific cosmic connection. And there are other amazing things that the dung beetle does too, like it sort of collects poop and redistributes it, obviously, and burying it and breaking it down. So it means that the fly population is kept in check, and it also kind of acts like a fertilizer spreader as it's moving all around. So it's such an amazing part of our overall ecosystem, and we sort of forget that we really need animals like this to sort of shovel shit, if you will. I hate to say it, but it's such an amazing creature. Now, we don't know if the ancient Egyptians knew all this about the scarab beetle, but we do think that they recognized this role of taking waste and creating life, because they would see the young of the scarab emerge from this big ball of poop. And here we are, just if you're on Chile with me, we're looking at Delta cancri. And as I mentioned, this is the southern donkey, so Acellus australis. And yeah, an amazing 2.4 billion years old. And it's an orange giant star. I don't know if we'll get this coming through in the telescopes, and it's 180 light years away. An interesting fact about this star: it was involved in the first recorded occultation by Jupiter. So this observation, it was made in 240 BC. This observation. So the most ancient observation of Jupiter, which we are acquainted with, is that reported by Ptolemy in Almagest, actually. So when the planet eclipsed the star, this star we're looking at here, Delta Cancri. So kind of amazing that we're looking at this now, and it people were looking at this star 240 BC as Jupiter moved across it. It's phenomenal. But back to our beloved dung beetle, and I don't know about you, but I kind of fallen in love with the dung beetle this week. So the Egyptians, they may not have known this connection, as I mentioned, but they did see life come out of waste. So the scarab beetle was seen as, a creator of life out of nothing, or like a regenerator of life. We also know that they put this connection together of the movement of this ball of poop, which could be considered like, the creation, sort of I don't know what you'd call it, but I'm going to call it a manger for now, or like a womb of where life would come from later of the scarab beetle. They sort of had this connection of that being rolled across the plains by the scarab beetle as similar to the movement of the sun disk across the sky. And indeed, the ancient Egyptians believed that Khepri was an aspect of the solar god Aten, rolled the ball of the sun across the sky every day. And on the main page, where I've put some images, you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner some depictions of Khepri, where he is a man with the head of a dung beetle. Sometimes he was just depicted as a dung beetle, but for some reason around sort of funeral rites and in the tomb, he was depicted as this man with a scarab beetle head. So now you can sort of begin to see how this lowly dung beetle was sort of connected to creation and rebirth. And also what kind of amazes me is just the whole of the constellation Cancer, and we'll talk about this in more detail as the night goes on, and particularly the dung beetle and the story of the dung beetle. To me, this is a constellation about humility, because you wouldn't even, if you didn't know, you would just dismiss a dung beetle as the lowliest of the low, perhaps. And kind of even in keeping with that, Khepri never had his own cult. He was just kind of like part of the solar deities, but really he was, no one was worshipping on his own. He was just kind of there, this sort of very faint, if you will, I don't even want to say God, because he didn't really sort of have that kind of status. But there he was, just sort of, seen to be rolling the sun across the sky. So, I mean, maybe that explains why such a faint set of stars were chosen for this, to sort of represent this wonderful sacred dung beetle. We don't know. I mean, we really don't know why they ended up being chosen. So I'm just going to pause now because we are hopefully switching to a galaxy. And here you can flip also over to Canary 3. I just want to, which should be Canary. There we go. Okay. I just noticed they have numbers. Crazy, huh? I'm just looking at the tabs at the bottom. Canary Ultra Wide Field is the one we want. So I'm not seeing it yet, but so I'm just going to flip back to Chile. Somewhere in there. Is that it emerging in the middle? Just so we're actually looking at, well, hopefully it's NGC 2535 or 2536. And it's two connecting galaxies. I'm hopeful we'll see something. I'm not sure whether they're going to be strong enough. So NGC 2535 is an unbarred spiral galaxy, and it's interacting with NGC 2536, which is a barred spiral galaxy. And I'm just going to read you something that I read earlier about it. So it says the interaction between these two galaxies has warped the disk and the spiral arms of NGC 2535, producing an elongated structure, visible at ultraviolet wavelengths that contain many bright, recently formed blue star clusters, in addition to the enhanced star-forming regions around the galaxy center. So you might just want to flip around between Canary 3, which to me is looking like a cluster. There you go. Sorry, just bear with me. Just looking at these, seeing if we can see a hint of a galaxy. Okay, well, we'll carry on with our story. So as I was saying, we don't really know why that this sort of faint collection of stars was chosen. Often these constellations' importance is because this sort of the star pattern's importance is because it was where the sun rose on the spring equinox, for example. But for Cancer, that would have been 8,000 to 6,000 BC. So we know it's not that, because you think you'd have had Gemini and Taurus since then by the time Queen Nefertiti arrives. And another theory is that about why Cancer was chosen, such a faint constellation, for something so incredibly sacred, was that apparently the constellation was also known as the dark sign. So maybe there is this sort of connection with creation, like happening in the dark. Possibly that's why they chose this group of stars. And indeed, to Chaldean and Platonic philosophy, says William Alcott, this constellation was seen as where the souls of men were supposed to come from and then descend into the body. So we can sort of see a parallel there to like how the dung beetle's young suddenly just seemed to emerge from the dark, this sort of emerging of souls into manifestation out of the dark. And another theory derives itself from other names given to this constellation. So while we're talking about it as the scarab beetle and we know it as the crab, some historians claim it was also known as the tortoise in 4000 BC. And so it's sort of odd that these kind of hard-shelled creatures that don't travel at great speeds were seen in this collection of stars. And it's a bit of a leap to me, but there are a couple of theories about how the sun's apparent movement in the sky when it arrives in this constellation, so June, July time, it's very slow, something called an alemma. So it appears the sun to move slowly, and maybe that's why, but I don't know. To me, it feels there's something in the hard shell that speaks to me more than sort of the slowness of these three creatures, because the dung beetle can move, and we've all seen crabs. They can get up some speed. They're not going as fast as a cheetah, perhaps, but they are moving it. So we don't know. And actually, it seems like the Greeks, who we know named our current zodiac, still held the scarab beetle in really high regard. So how did it become the crab? Because the scarab was associated with Zeus. And because of its connection to rebirth, warriors would often wear a scarab amulet. And Zeus was seen as sort of, the overseer of warriors. So the scarab kind of got thrown in with him. And the lowly dung beetles took up rank, really, with the mighty eagle as Zeus's animal sidekicks, if you will. And there's even an Aesop's fable about it that I'll share with you. But again, I just wanted to pause so we can talk through what we're seeing or not seeing through our telescopes. Either way, it's beautiful. We're looking deep into our constellation Cancer, which we just wouldn't be able to see with our naked eye. So it's wonderful. So this is supposed to be NGC 2623. So it's another galaxy, and it's a really kind of special galaxy, I think. It's in the late stage of merging with another galaxy. And it's thought that actually the Milky Way will end up resembling it when it collides with Andromeda Galaxy in about 4 billion years' time. And this particular galaxy was discovered in 1885 by French astronomer Edouard de Jean-Marie Stéphane. So I'm just going to hop around again and check out Canary Ultra Wide Field and see what we're seeing there. Okay. So if zooming in, maybe you can see something there that I'm not seeing. But we are pointed towards these galaxies for sure. At least I should be. That's what I put in the mission, but maybe that's my mistake. We'll see. Maybe something will emerge out of the dark, like the young of the dung beetle popping out of the dung. But here is this Aesop's fable. So an eagle was once pursuing a hare, and this hare, seeing its position was hopeless, turned to the only creature whom fate offered for help, and it was a scarab beetle. The hare begged the beetle to save him, and the scarab beetle reassured him that he would. And upon the eagle's approach, the beetle beseeched the eagle not to carry off the hare, but the eagle, disdaining the small size and insignificance of the scarab beetle, devoured the hare as the beetle looked on. So the scarab beetle was just horrifying because it made this promise to the hare, and full of sort of revenge, it never stopped seeking out the places where the eagle builds her nest. And when the eggs were laid, the beetle would get into the nest, hoist himself up, and with his back legs roll the eggs out of the nest like it does its dung, so they would fall and break. And the eagle, because it's consecrated to Zeus, appealed to Zeus to help her find a safe sanctuary where she could raise her young, and Zeus allowed her to lay eggs in his lap. But the scarab beetle saw through the trick, and he made a pellet of dung, took flight, because dung beetles can fly, and when he got over the lap of Zeus, let it fall. And Zeus stood up to shake off the dung pellet, and in doing so the eggs were thrown to the ground without his thinking. And since that time, it is said eagles no longer nest during the season when the scarab beetle appears. So a lovely fable, a bit odd I guess, but kind of with this message of don't dismiss the smallest insignificant things, or perhaps if we do that with people, don't dismiss them, because well, they can come back and throw your eggs out of your basket, I suppose. But there's a message there for sure. So that kind of leads us into our sort of next step in the life of this constellation Cancer. So faint as it is, and history a bit blurred as how it became sort of adopted so widely as the crab, it's important in our ways, in a way that we may not even think about. And that is as the Tropic of Cancer. The Tropic of Cancer is named after this constellation, which seems so obvious when you say it, but we don't often think about it. I'm just going to pause for a moment as hopefully coming into view, let me see, will be the beehive cluster. So I've got this on also on Canary 3. Let's have a look. On Canary 3, if you pop over to Canary ultra wide field, you'll really get a good view of this beautiful cluster. And we're going to talk about it in a bit more detail in a minute. But yeah, it's just so marvelous. Oh, how beautiful to look at. In fact, let's pause there and actually talk about the beehive cluster, because I absolutely don't want to miss. I don't want to miss this. So this is M44, and it's John Herschel that we think first called this the beehive in 1833. And it's kind of fun, as we're looking at this, to sort of imagine it as a swarm of bees. Actually it was Galileo first sort of claimed this, discovered it as a cluster, and to him he said it was about 40 stars, but it's actually more than 1,000 in this cluster. It was known for an antiquity back in the year 83 actually as Praesepe, which actually means to enclose, and is also comes from the word for the nativity scene. So it's thought this is actually called the manger, that the ancients saw this as a manger, which I just love, that it was sort of kept in by the two stars we saw earlier, Gamma Cancri and Delta Cancri, the northern and southern donkeys. So they're just adorable. So it's kind of amazing because if you sort of think about this, to the ancient Egyptians, this whole constellation was connected to rebirth and also resurrection. That's why scarab beetles were put inside tombs, sort of to help people sort of be reborn. And so you think of this as having a close connection to Christ, obviously with his resurrection. It's kind of amazing that those two stories, like, both sort of channeled into this constellation. So it's thought that this term Praesepe comes from a place in the 7th century where the remains of the Holy Manger were brought. It was a church. So Stephen James O'Meara, who's just writes some really wonderful books about astronomy, and he says perhaps the ancients, when they looked up, without having this wonderful telescope to use, maybe they saw like a straw-like cloud of unresolved starlight between these two stars, and kind of just and put that together as it being the two donkeys looking over a manger of straw. And that sort of ties in a bit more with the naming of this cluster called the beehive, because in 19th century England, when John Herschel lived, who named it the beehives were actually made of straw, not today. So maybe there is this kind of connection between what we call the beehive and the manger, as both being sort of similar to straw. And if you can see this cluster with binoculars on a very dark night. I have yet to see it with binoculars, but I know people have. So it's well worth getting out there and having a look. I mean, obviously it was seen with a naked eye, So in very, very dark skies, because that's why it got its name back in the year 83, it was called Prasepe. And the connections with Christ and this cluster actually sort of go on and on and on. Like there's a Breton legend, for example, that talks about how the falling tears of Christ were turned into bees and flew away to bring sweetness to the world, which is just beautiful. And then O'Meara goes on to say that if you look long enough under a very dark sky, you may be able to make out the face of Christ underneath a veil of stars. And if you, on the main page, where I've got the images, you can see on the right hand side, I've took a picture of what O'Meara is talking about. And he has a comparison of the beehive cluster to this sort of veiled face of Christ. And he says that it's perhaps sort of people saw in it Veronica's veil. So Veronica, if you don't know, is sort of at the sixth station of Christ. And it's said that she used her veil to wipe the sweat of Jesus and the blood off his face as he's on his way to Calvary. And it left an imprint of his whole face on her veil. Sort of like the Turin Shroud, kind of sort of a similar idea. And so you can, and what Stephen O'Meara says, that if you sort of look long enough and hard enough, you can kind of see this face of Christ perhaps in the beehive cluster. As with this kind of veil over it, and there you would see sort of parts of the veil being the donkeys. But there are tons of connections actually between the scarab and Christ. It's really interesting how this constellation has a lot of kind of Christian connections as well as like ancient Egyptian and Greek connections. So for example, in one of the Psalms, it says, "But I am a worm and no man," and it's been said that it was actually said, "I am a scarab and no man," because it was thought that worms kind of just resurrected themselves and never died. But the scarab also, because it was sort of seen as this resurrecting creature. It's thought that actually there were a lot of connections to Christ and the scarab, and you can look online and it goes on and on. There are a lot of references to old versions of the Bible that talk about the land of the scarab, and that very early Gnostic Christians used to wear a scarab as a sign. Yeah, sort of amazing. So I'm looking at Canary 3 and I'm not seeing the beehive cluster. I don't know what is going on right now. I'm just checking my time in case I'm off. Okay. Right. So I'm just going to click on Chile, see where we are. So in Chile, we're definitely supposed to be on the beehive cluster. So as you can see, it's a bit confusing tonight. It's a blessing to have all telescopes on. But sometimes what happens is at the beginning of the week, I think, well, let's just book Canary and hope Canary comes on. And then later in the week, it looks like Canary's not going to work. So I'm like, okay, I'll book Chile. And then we end up with a whole bunch of bookings at once. Okay. But coming up, we have the cluster M67. So it could well be that what we're looking at right now on Canary 3 is M67. Okay, but I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So coming back to this connection that we often don't even make in our heads about Cancer, and that's with the Tropic of Cancer. So the Tropic of Cancer is, as you probably know, the most northerly circle of latitude on Earth at which the sun can be directly overhead. And that occurs on the June solstice, when the northern hemisphere is like tilted towards the sun to its maximum extent. And when the line of latitude was named 2,000 years ago, that occurred when the sun was in the constellation Cancer. The solstice occurred in Cancer. And the word tropic means turn, referring to the fact that the sun appears to kind of turn back a little at the solstice. Or it just appears to turn back at the solstice, not just a little. So it's possibly a clue to why this moved from the scarab beetle to the crab, perhaps, that maybe the sun's apparent back and forth sideways movement in the sky reminded people of the movement of a crab. So we don't know. We don't really know how this amazing lowly constellation has... we don't know the exact reasons, but we do know that it has such a wonderful place, place of such importance in our world. And maybe we don't look at it today as a scarab beetle and have this sacred meaning, but it's there for us to look at through binoculars normally on a very, very dark night. And it means, it's a wonderful line that goes across the earth, and it takes in Baja and Mexico and Bahamas and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and where else? Oman, India, parts of South China all lie on the Tropic of Cancer. So again, this sort of incredibly faint constellation that we may not even think about, that we might dismiss, and it has such rich meaning in our lives today, and also from sort of like still has a sort of spiritual meaning, really. I was looking to see if crabs had anything kind of as interesting as the lowly dung beetle when it comes to sort of cosmic connection, and all I could find was that apparently the snapping potential of the claws of the fiddler crab becomes stronger in a full moon. And also soft-shell crabs molt. Apparently they molt more in a full moon, although there's some discussion about whether that's true or not. Maybe it's just the sort of cycle of the crab. And other crab species like the horseshoe crab are thought to come ashore, or they're seen to come ashore to spawn during evening high tides at full and new moons. So while the crab may not have as an exciting a cosmic connection, it certainly does have at least a lunar connection. Okay, so I think we're on the M67. I'm not sure, and I must apologise. I don't know, and I checked everything we're going through tonight, so I'm not sure what happens, why we've gone a little bit awry. But N67 is the King Cobra cluster, and you can try saying that after a few cups of moonshine. I don't know why it's called the King Cobra cluster. I had a look. Why wouldn't it be called King Crab? Seems more obvious, but it's the King Cobra cluster, and this is 4 to 5 billion years old. Just blows my mind. So I'm on Canary 3, and you'll also see it on Chile. Okay, great. Now we seem to have synced up again, at least. And in fact, Chile to me is feels more like looking at a cluster. So it's at 4 to 5 billion years old, and it's one of the oldest star clusters known, and it is 2,600 light years away, which is 5 times further than the Beehive cluster, and it has more than 100 stars similar to the sun. So Johann Gottfried Köhler discovered this in 1779, but I gather it was sort of also discovered independently by Charles Messier. And it's undergone mass segregation, which means that its heavier stars have moved towards the cluster's centre, and the less massive ones have migrated towards like the outer regions over time. And as a result, the cluster stars are much more gravitationally bound than those in younger open clusters, which is why it's so old. We don't often see clusters that are so old. And it's expected to stay together because of this phenomenon for another 5 billion years before it disassociates, which just blows my mind. Already it's 5 billion years old, and it's going to be there together for another 5 billion years. It's just so hard to even comprehend. Okay. There we go. So now I believe we are, I keep saying this, we are moving on to, oh Lord. So I'm going to switch over to Canary 2. If you want to join me over on Canary 2. Okay. So we're actually going to pop back to Acubens. And that's simply because the way the telescopes are this evening, what's in their range, is that these times around the edges, we can't see some of the, I would love to have hung out a bit more on the beehive, but we're having a bit, I sort of had a bit of trouble in trying to get the beehive on without, other than just kind of in the middle of both Chile and and Canary, and in fact Canary 2 it was only visible earlier on. But I wanted to talk back a bit about the beehive cluster. So what I'm going to do in order to do that is I'm going to share an image that Dave M took of the beehive cluster. It's a mosaic and it's unbelievably beautiful. So let me just do that. If you, of course, feel free to carry on looking at the stars through Canary 2. But here we go. On the images. There we go. Oh my goodness, it's just beautiful. So this, as I say, is the deep beehive cluster mosaic, and it was shared by Dave M in discussions, and I'm so grateful to him for having this and having worked hard on this beautiful picture, because I want to talk a bit more about the beehive cluster. So it's a 400 million years old, and it's only 515 light years away. So what I love about this is the light reaching us from the beehive cluster actually comes from a time on Earth where like the plants were just beginning to blossom and the earliest known sharks roamed the sea, and the earliest insects were about. So just amazing. And actually this is the light coming from this cluster is 200 million years before the dung beetle would have arrived on the planet, or would have emerged on the planet, however you want to say it. And on Messier's list, the only two brighter clusters in this are the Pleiades, and then brighter than is the Andromeda Galaxy. An interesting fact that this was designated by the state of Utah in 1996 as its kind of like its state cluster. I didn't know every state had a cluster. But Utah, because it has the beehive, decided that this particular cluster is the cluster of Utah. And the whole of this cluster spans 39 light years. It's just unbelievable. And it's not just stars, there are planets in here. In 2012, scientists discovered 2 planets, and they're orbiting 2 separate stars. And they were the first 2 planets detected orbiting stars like our own sun, situated in an open star cluster. So planets have been found before in clusters, but not orbiting stars like our sun. So it's a really, really special cluster. And also it was sort of connected to weather. So Greek poet and philosopher Aratus mentioned the manger, as it's also known, as we talked about, in 260 BC. So, oh my goodness, so long ago that this beautiful cluster has been talked about. And he says, "Watch to the manger, like a faint mist in the north, it plays the guide beneath Cancer. Around it are born 2 faintly gleaming stars, not far apart nor very near, but distant to view at a cubit's length, one on the north, which we know is our northern donkey, while the other looks towards the south. They are called the asses, and between them is the manger. When the sky is clear, when all of a sudden the manger wholly disappears, then the stars on either side seem to draw near to one another, he says. Then there will be a storm in which the fields are deluged. But if the manger darkens and both stars do stay as they are, it's a bit confusing, they herald rain." So I think what he's saying is that I don't really know what he's saying. He's saying that when the sky is clear and the manger disappears, but only the stars remain, then you'll have storms. Okay. But if the sky is clear and both stars remain unaltered, then that means they herald rain. I don't really know what he's talking about. But if the ass to the north of the manger, he says, shines feebly through a faint mist, while the southern ass is gleaming, then you can have wind from the south. And if in turn the southern ass is cloudy and the northern bright, watch for the north wind. So it seems like the most convoluted, complicated way of looking at this cluster and determining the weather. But there you go. He was a poet and philosopher, so who am I to say what's right or wrong? So just flicking back to our telescopes, there was something I did set up sort of kind of last minute, so I don't know if it's going to work. And that was, I really wanted to show you our TARF. You'll see our TARF on the image of the crab that's on the sort of main page. If you're looking on YouTube, it'll be that page. And our TARF means the end or the edge, which kind of made me laugh because I thought about U2's guitarist being called our TARF. And it's actually the brightest in the constellation. So I booked it for Canary 3 and say I don't know if it'll work because I don't know if it's too bright. No, that seems to be just fine, actually. Okay, great. I'm thrilled. And this is 267 light years away from Earth. And Stephen James O'Meara describes this as a golden doubloon dipped in blood. So I'm not sure we're really sort of getting the colours through tonight, but it's an orange K-type giant, and it has a red dwarf companion star with about 76,000 year orbit, which is sort of blows my mind. And it's 61 times the radius of the sun. In 2014, discovered that it seems to have a planet, and it's about 7.8 times the mass of Jupiter, this planet. So really unbelievable. Now to me, I'm getting more blue through this, but it is an orange K-type giant. Okay. Right. Sorry, I'm just looking at the star here. Great. So we're heading towards the top of the hour, and I kind of just wanted to share, sort of kind of wrap up really. And sort of thanks for bearing with me tonight. I know we've been a bit all over the place. It's kind of a challenging constellation to put together, and in fact next week I was sort of hoping to do Canis Major, but I'll have a similar problem. You can see Sirius at a certain time, like at the top of the hour, and then you can't see it again, and a lot of Canis Major you can't see. So I'm not sure what we'll do. I think maybe we'll take a tiny bit of Canis Major and stick with Canis Minor to keep it really simple, so we can kind of delve in and sort of move into our stories more. But as I say, tonight was a bit of a cobble together, trying to get it all to work out. As I'm sure you're aware, if you're booking missions yourselves on the telescopes, it doesn't always line up very smoothly. But I kind of just wanted to sort of circle back to this sort of feeling really that sort of comes from the constellation Cancer. And that is, that it's, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like such a really humble or humbling even constellation, that it is so faint. And yet, within it lie galaxies and, clusters with planets in. So even though we might dismiss it, it's super rich in terms of what it has lying inside it. But even sort of the sentiment of the stories around it, like Christ's face being seen within the beehive cluster, or the thought of it sort of being this manger, this very sweet place of the birth of Christ with two donkeys around it. Or if you sort of, stepping away from Christianity, look at it as this lowly dung beetle seen by the ancient Egyptians, who sort of lived and breathed in poop, basically, but has such a important role on the planet, and was even seen to be pushing the biggest god of all, the sun, rolling it across the sky. And all the while, as I say, we could just look up at night and not even notice that there it is between sort of like Gemini and up from Hydra and over from Procyon and slightly down from Regulus. There's just sort of this like dark patch that we don't often point our telescope towards or our binoculars. So I really recommend getting out and seeing if you can have a look, and also maybe coming and booking some missions with a bit more grace than I have done this evening. Just picking a couple of stars rather than trying to get 8 in a go, and having a look or looking at the Beehive cluster, say, in more detail, because I really just think it's such a beautiful, humble constellation. We didn't even talk about its role as a crab. It has such a minor role in the Greek tragedy. I mean, this tiny crab comes on, nips at Heracles' heel, and then is squashed by him, sort of like a 30-second walk-in role in a Greek tragedy, this constellation, which is, we've talked about Greek stories of these constellations for tens of minutes. So it's just, you could just miss this beautiful constellation if you weren't kind of looking, I guess. So just to wrap up, I wanted to share this really sweet view about the dung beetle and this constellation. This is from, and I've read from her before, Susanna Hislop. I just love her take on the constellations. So she says, under the vast darkness of an African night sky, a dung beetle is rolling a ball of dung across the savannah. This teeny-brained scarab has sniffed out the most nutritious feces it could find, packed it into a sphere about 40 times its own size, and is now transporting it back to its nest in a startlingly straight line. A friend of his once tried to roll dung in the daytime and was sizzled to death by the heat of the sun when he barely set out. Another was ambushed by a rival gang who had seen the unsuspicious creature leaving the swarming dung heap, followed him, stolen his precious cargo. So this wise scarab is doing it at night. He's journeying through the darkness, as his family has done for centuries, in a way that it took those big-brained human scientists right up until 2013 to understand. He is navigating by the stars. He's using his spindly back legs to push it along. He's orientating his ball of dung in a long straight path by the light of the Milky Way. Does he know that 2,000 and more years ago, ancient Egyptians were fashioning amulets in his likeness and placing them as sacred objects in the royal tombs, or transporting them on ships across oceans? Does this humble dung beetle know there was a time when his forebears were worshipped on a par with Khepri and the sun god, and Khepri who rolled this precious globe, the sun, across the sky? Does he know he was seen as a symbol of creation and rebirth? Does he know his connection to Christ? Does he know that sometimes Khepri himself was depicted as having the same head as him, whom the Egyptians also honoured in the stars as the constellation Scarabaeus? Does he know that he has a constellation named after him? I just love this. And I think it's just kind of a reminder to us all that, that could be us. We don't know. We don't know how the role that we play in the world. And so, all we can do is be humble like this beloved dung beetle and get our hands dirty and and see what happens. So thank you for bearing with me for this evening. I'm sorry, it was a bit, we jumped around a lot. So next week, as I say, I'm not sure. I think I'm going to try and keep it very simple and just stick with Canis Minor. But if we miss Canis Major next week, if we miss Sirius, then I don't think we're going to have a chance to look at Sirius this year, because I don't know if it's going to be visible around this time. And I know that many of us are trying to catch the winter circle, the winter hexagon, and Sirius would be our last star in that. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to make a decision probably tomorrow. But there are lots of lovely things coming up this week. So Dr. Paige Godfrey has her intro to astronomy on Wednesday, and this week she's looking at the Milky Way. So how perfect we can get to know the Milky Way, maybe as well as the dung beetle knows the Milky Way. And Paul Cox really is going to be back next week. I even spoke to him this week, so I know that he's up and he's living, and he really is going to be back next Sunday talking practical astronomy and also sharing some of the things that we can see in the week ahead. So he'll be here shortly before I'm here next Sunday. And then, of course, coming up on the 31st is the blue moon lunar eclipse. And we'll all be on actually talking about that from very different angles. So don't miss that. In the meantime, I put some things up in Illuminations if you want to read anything. I also put Susanna Hislop's little story about the scarab beetle on Illuminations. You can head to the discussions board and fill me in on where I've gone wrong this evening. and I'm always take advice. I really love it when our members sort of can share with me the best telescopes to use, because they've been using them a lot longer than I have. So I'm really grateful. And if you are new to Slooh, don't ever be afraid to put anything on a discussion board, because the members are so kind and helpful that they will help you and guide you and share with you what they consider the gems of the sky. So definitely hop over. And as I said, book a mission to the Beehive cluster. It's in Slooh 500. So you'll be able to do that. In the meantime, keep me posted how your winter circle hexagon is going. And I wish you many clear skies, even though you may not even still see this wonderful constellation Cancer. So from me, that's all. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Here, a local sponge diver from Yalikavak, a village near Bodrum in Turkey, discovered evidence of a shipwreck close to the east shore of Uluburun, that's in southwest Turkey. And over 10 years and 22,413 dives, it was pieced together that the ship was made from cedar and oak from Lebanon, had likely set sail from Syria in 14 BC and was travelling to Greece, headed to one of the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, with Mycenaean officials on board guarding its precious royal cargo. And it carried vast amounts of copper and tin ready to become bronze, logs of ebony or blackwood and ivory in the form of elephant tusks. There were like a dozen hippopotamus teeth and ostrich eggshells and pottery and gold and gems of agate and quartz and arrowheads and daggers and cumin and coriander and figs and olives and so many things on board this ship. But there was one very precious item, and that was a gold scarab beetle believed to have belonged to none other than Queen Nefertiti, because it had her name on. Mild, it's been so beautiful. I've seen the Orion Nebula that we looked at last week with binoculars. It's so clear. I looked for Cancer. Oh boy, did I look for these stars. You just can't see them. I couldn't see them. So you really need some dark skies. But although it is the faintest zodiac constellation, it is so interesting. So we have got so much to talk about tonight. So as we're jumping around the stars, I thought this page might be helpful so you can sort of see what stars we might be looking at in relation to the entire constellation. You'll see some images here. We're going to talk about the dung beetle. We're going to talk about some Egyptian mythology, the beehive cluster we're going to delve into and look at sort of tales of Christ relating to the beehive cluster, and then also obviously talk about the crab and where did the crab come from. So before, to get going, we are going to start our story with a shipwreck. So in the summer of 1982, Mehmed Kakir. Good evening and welcome to Slooh. My name is Helen Avery and I'll be here with you the next, hour or so. And tonight we're looking at the constellation Cancer. So there's a lot going on this evening when we're looking at Cancer. So I just kind of wanted to talk you through what might be helpful for you. So amazingly, we've got both telescopes open tonight. We've got Chile and the Canary Islands, which is fantastic. But what happens is what you can see in Chile of the constellation Cancer, you can't see at the same time in Canary Islands. So I've kind of sort of booked the two telescopes, Canary 2 from 9:10, and Chile from now until 10 to 10, and that was kind of what I could get. I couldn't get a full hour on both, but so we're going to sort of be jumping around, so kind of just bear with me. And I would suggest, if you want to make it easier, we're going to stick with Chile, and then we'll move, even just to get started, is Iota Cancri. Iota Cancri, you might say, but I say Iota Cancri. And actually, Mario recommended that we take a look at this, and we're starting with it. It was the only time I could actually get this up in the next hour. So this is a double star, about 300 light years away from Earth, and of course we can see it's a double star. And the brightest star is a yellow G-type bright giant, and so we're going to sort of hang on that. And the fainter is a white A-type main sequence dwarf. So I didn't want you to miss that as we begin. Okay, but I'm just for now going to leap back to the main page that I was on, which just has some images up. So the one you'll see on YouTube and on the live cast page. So Cancer as a constellation is so faint. It's really, really hard to see with the naked eye. We've got like such clear skies here in the northeast at the minute, and I've been out the last couple of nights. It's moved to Canary 3, kind of halfway through for some of the more distant objects. Like we're gonna look at some galaxies tonight, and the Beehive cluster, and the King Cobra cluster. So you can obviously, on Canary 2, there are a couple of other things I'll point out to you that I haven't booked for Chile. So just to sort of, I know it sounds confusing, but we're going to stay, if you will, stay on Chile and then Canary 3 with me. And of course, if you're on YouTube, you can just enjoy the audio. And I'm going to put up a screen in a minute, because also, as we're going through a lot of things, I don't want to keep skipping back to images for you, so I'm just going to leave them up. So let's do that now. There we go. Okay, but before all this, I just want to point out to you that if you are with us in the space station room and you click on let me think, Chile ultra wide field, whoa, that or Chile wide field. Okay, there we go. What we're actually looking at here